Welcome to Aliens with JW, the podcast where aliens have conversations with humans. Today's episode, I'm sitting down with the host and producer of Sound Objectivity, a podcast about career growth, personal development, and strategic thinking. David Campaña, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone.
Let's start at the beginning. What inspired you to start your podcast?
Well, it's funny because I think the podcast, or for me, the podcast is just more of an extension of something that I've done for the better part of 20 years, which is mentorship. So, one of the things that I've done throughout my 30-year professional professional career is mentor. I always like to go back to my alma maters. I like to go back to speak to some of the people that I helped through their careers, and mentor, or many cases they seek out mentorship through to me, um, and just really helping folks in the early parts of their careers, in the middle parts of their careers, you know, giving them the practical advice and giving them the practical guidance that you don't find in books. All of us matriculated through college, or many of us matriculated through college, but there's so many unwritten rules in corporate America. There's so many of subtle nuances that you have to learn in working in corporate America and working with other professionals. And my podcast seeks to help people understand how to make decisions in corporate America, how to build yourself in corporate America, and how not to be afraid of change in corporate America.
Well, your intro is kind of like it's interesting because of I'm one of your mentees. I'm one of the
Correct.
people that you mentored and you helped coach through corporate America. And so, like, all the things that you've done with your podcast and I've been listening to, it's like, these are the things that you were telling me when I first started my career and I was interning for you when you were helping me develop my career. And so it's like, it's really beautiful to see your podcast and how you've helped people throughout their journey. And I'm one of the people that's benefited from your advice throughout all these years. So when I first started by saying, giving your flowers and saying thank you so much for helping guide me through my career and helping give me the encouragement to be myself and to navigate all the career changes. And I think I probably also have to say the advice that you've given me also helped inspire me to be and do this podcast. And like hearing you hear your words and putting your voice out there, I was like, if David can do it, I know I can do it as well. So I just want to also say that thank you so much as well.
No, no problem. That's exactly the point. I'm a leader through example. So no barrier is too high. There isn't a dream that's too large. Provided you have a plan, you're objective about it, and you work towards your goals, anything is possible. And I try to, my job as a professional is to try to put people in the opportunities for them to find themselves, find what they're good at, find their new passions, or continue to expand on their current passions. It's all about providing opportunity and watching those flourish in those opportunities.
Yeah, and to lead me to my next question, how does your own journey shape the content that you create?
It's interesting because I create content on the things that I struggle with myself. you know it's interesting because we could read textbooks, and we obviously we read the news, and we go to work every day, and we all have different sets of issues. So there isn't a shortage of issues, and there isn't a shortage of ways for us to make ourselves better on a day-to-day basis. So sometimes it's you have to pick yourself up because you're feeling imposter syndrome. Sometimes you want to elevate your emotional intelligence. All these things resonate not only for myself but for any professional out there. Again, it's more about the softer side of things, the things that you're not going to, the lessons you're not going to find in a textbook. And it's really more about having conversations on how to elevate yourself in your career.
Yeah, and I mentioned you said something about imposter syndrome. Like in creating the podcast, how did you find ways to continue to produce content while trying to figure out that aspect of imposter syndrome? How did you figure out how to continue to create amazing episodes to impact people?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just speaking to people. I'm an avid people watcher. So I am constantly looking around and having conversations with people and just asking them, where are you in your career? What do you like about your career? What are things that you would want to change in your career? Artificial intelligence, how is that affecting you in your career? How is it affecting you in your personal life? So, I really just look around and I speak to the people around me and I try to understand their perspective. One of my favorite words is perspective because there are many ways to look at something. There are many ways to look at opportunities. There are many ways to look at challenges. And when I start thinking about, uh, what are the challenges out there? One of the biggest challenges out there is imposter syndrome, and it's not only for the newly, college graduates. It's for seasoned professionals as well, where you get into that rut, where you get into that, you get into the monotony of every day, and you're like, well, what have I accomplished? Uh, what am I doing? Am I really good at what I'm doing? And sometimes it just takes, it takes us a we need to take a step back sometimes from ourselves to really, as they say, appreciate all of the things that you have done. As they say, you have to take time to smell the flowers. You need to really understand the accomplishments that you have achieved and really think about what you contribute to the organization. And some of us lose sight of that. And my podcast helps people think about those times. Remember, you are a matriculated college graduate. Remember, you have delivered on that particular project. Remember, you have, been a part of a successful team. Um, just because one project didn't go well doesn't mean that you are not good at this. The best people learn from their mistakes. So again, my podcast is looks at it through those lenses. It looks through not only the successes but the places where you can learn. One of the things that I like to say on my podcast is blessings and lessons. You have to appreciate them both. If you do fail, learn from that. Learn why you failed or learn why you weren't successful. So then the next time it comes around, you can succeed.
Hmm. And talking about learning things, what is something that you've learned about creating your episodes and creating your podcast?
It's interesting that we're talking about imposter syndrome because one of the things I was thinking was, well, do I have enough to share? Do I have enough ideas to actually create a podcast and talk about this? From not only from my perspective, but sharing what I'm hearing from my peers and my mentees and my coworkers and my team members, and I'm at episode 49. So clearly, I've pushed past any kind of doubt that I might have had, just because there's so many things to talk about. I've had the luxury of being an IT executive professional for nearly 30 years. In those 30 years, I have experienced quite a bit. I have four sons that are just starting their professional journeys, and I listen to them, and it's interesting to hear the problems that they're facing are the same problems that I was facing many years ago. The technologies may be different, but the situations and the issues are pretty much the same. So now it's a matter of, you can learn from experience, or you could learn by going through it yourself. So I tell my kids, I'm a cheat code for you. I've done this before. So I'm not going to give you the answer. It's more about you formulating the right questions. If you formulate the right questions, then we can have the discussion on finding the best solutions. So that's, as you know, I was never one to give you the answers. I will give you an outline. I will give you, a direction, but I would never give you the answer, because the answer is for you to find out, so I can get your perspective on what it should be.
Yeah, and that's the thing I've always respected about you as a leader and a mentor is that you gave us the ability to figure out for ourselves what was the answers, how to build our own roadmap, and you were a guide to help us. And you just every time you would do something, you'd be like, you would just drop seeds on us. You would just drop some knowledge to make us expand our mind and look at different perspectives and like not just like what can happen, plan A, plan B, plan C, alternatives to treat the things that can happen to us, and plan for the good, the bad, and all the things that you might not even think about can happen. So so this is like your approach is like, it's bringing back memories for all things you used to tell me as well.
Yeah, it's all about perspective. That's the thing that happens when well, we went to engineering school, and in engineering, it's all about logic. I have a degree in mathematics, so everything has to be broken down. And like you said, you have to have your optimal plan, your contingency plan, your fallback plans. And if you get used to thinking in that fashion, all of your work starts to elevate because now you're thinking much deeper at the particular problem. You're thinking strategically about the problem, not tactically. Although tactically, sometimes you do need to act tactically. If the kick is flooding, you got to just shut the water off. You don't have to, think about strategy. But it's also understanding when to be tactical, when to be strategic, and when you're strategic, having a clear and articulate plan. That can change as data changes.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of, I think, when I was like first being your mentee, how you had us do that 5 year increment plan for like, it was like 30 to 40 year plan, and plan out our lives about, hey, what's going to happen in the first 5 years. I think this happened. I was like in my early 20s at the time, and you like plan out your first 5 years, and you were like, put the what you want to achieve, what's going to be the setbacks that's going to hold you back into your life, what's going to be the peaks and valleys, and then plan out your next 5 years. And I think that was one of the most impactful things that led me to my own career. And right now, and I look at that roadmap, this is where I'm at today, being creative, being an entrepreneur, producing my own content. And so that's, I want to say thank you for that as well, because of that advice is, I've been following that advice throughout my whole career to this day. So thank you so much for that as well. And so I think that leads into my next question. Were you always passionate about personal development, or did something spark that in you?
I would say, I don't know if it was always in me, but what I would say is in the very beginning of my career, essentially when I was in your shoes, when I met you, one of the things that I did notice is there were not many people like me in mentoring positions. Again, I started in corporate in the mid '90s, and there weren't as many Hispanics or as many African Americans in leadership roles, and there weren't that many leadership opportunities. And so when I would try to look for advice, try to navigate the waters in the early parts of my career, I really didn't have anybody that looked like me, that spoke like me, that understood my perspective of where I was coming from. Um, and I saw that as a really big gap in professional development. Again, coming from undergrad, the upperclassmen helped the lowerclassmen. It was all of us, helped each other, and I figured that you needed to have something like that once you was in corporate America. And I didn't see that. And yes, they have mentoring programs, but again, they didn't have many minorities in those programs. So as I started matriculating through my career, and once I started getting into roles where I could provide opportunities, i.e., once I became a person that managed people and managed teams and eventually managed organizations, that's really when I started to pivot and started to say, okay, now that I have essentially responsibility for, or at least partial responsibility for my team's success and their careers, let me make sure that I develop and provide guidance, the guidance that I wish I had when I was their age, so then that way they could excel. One of the things, and you probably remember me saying this, is, it took me about 10 years to get to the position that I was at that particular time, which was the chief technology officer. And it took me 10 years. And I said, so my goal is for anyone that wants to, matriculate through their career that quickly, I want to help you do that in less than 10 years. But nobody told me how to do it. I went and learned through my mistakes and, worked with my peers to eventually get there. And I have to thank many of my, prior mentors to help me there as well. But I also knew that now it's my turn to try to help folks. And there's really where my professional development started to, really come into fruition. When I started, having ownership of teams and ownerships of people's career. I was doing people's, career performance or their yearly performance, and putting people in different positions to learn and to grow, just like I did with you guys as interns. So I would say about 20 years ago, I was about 10 years into my career, is when that really started to really take shape. And I started taking mentorship, and personal development, career development a lot more seriously in terms of giving back to, to the people that'll be the future leaders of organizations.
Oh, that leads into my next question. Was there a specific moment when you realized that this show needed to exist? Or I mean, like your podcast needed to exist?
So I was actually having a dinner with my wife, and my wife asked me if I can speak to a colleague of hers. Now, my wife is not in. She's not in my field. She's not in IT, and at the time, she wasn't even in corporate America. She was working for state government. And the young lady wanted to talk about career. She wanted to talk about her career, and she wanted to make a pivot from one career to another. She didn't know she didn't know where to start. She didn't know even what to do. She didn't have an idea of what she wanted to do. She just knew that she wanted to change where she was. So, so we sat down, and we spoke for about an hour. And I gave her a breakdown. I was like, these are the questions you have to answer for yourself. This is the introspection that you have to do. And then once you do that, the output of that introspection is going to provide you options that you now will research to see what it is that inspires you, and let's see if that inspiration also aligns with something that has a wage associated with it. Not everything that you like is the thing that gets you paid, so trying to find that alignment. And I said, and eventually you'll get to that point, but you have to have a process. There is a process to this. There's a mentality that you have to have. There's resilience that you have to have. And after I had the conversation with her and I came back home, my wife was like, you know what, you really need to share your thoughts with folks, because I think if more folks heard you speak or heard your perspective on things, I think it could help a lot of people. And I think between that and all of the mentoring that I've done throughout the years, that was having the podcast was really a natural progression. It was really the next step of how I can help folks, either make that, again, we were talking before, make that transition to a new or different career, overcoming, imposter syndrome, regaining your passion in your current career, understanding resilience and compassion. So there are all these things. It doesn't matter what career you're in. It doesn't matter what industry vertical you're in. All of these things are human. These are human aspects that allow us to function better, in society. It makes us better humans. And if we're better humans and we make better decisions, then we have better outcomes for ourselves. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make better choices using perspective, so we have as much information as possible, so that we can then make the best choice for ourselves to be able to improve ourselves and go forward. And at the end of the day, that's what the podcast is about.
And I enjoy that part because like it's kind of like I've been using that advice for myself and like being creative. I was like I'm an artist, so I became an art teacher, and I'm like it gives me the opportunity to increase my perspective, but also to help others. But it also gives me the time to work on my own craft and experiment and do different things. So I did the same thing you're talking about. I thought strategically about each move I made in my career, and also looked at how does it align to my short-term goals and my long-term goals, then also my own personal development as a person. Is it along with my core values throughout my life? So I've been using that pathway that you gave us when we were your mentees at a younger age, and I've just been constantly to implement that. And I'm so happy to hear that you're constantly helping other people as well. And that leads me to my next question. Can you share a moment when you realized your podcast was truly impacting or helping people?
The best feedback that I get is when I hear somebody or when I get an email from someone saying, "Hey, this episode really helped me out," or "Your last episode really hit that soft spot," or I have this particular episode on repeat. The mere fact that people are willing to take 5 or 10 minutes to listen to an episode of my podcast, that actually humbles me. You know, that you'll give me your time, and more importantly, that you're giving me your trust in listening to my perspective. And those are the greatest moments when I get those. And of course, I don't do a lot of advertising for my podcast. I don't do a lot of social media even for my podcast. You know, my podcast has grown, honestly, really through word of mouth, like the old school way. It was people saying, "Hey, there's this wonderful podcast, and you should listen to it." And my episodes, as you know, are not very long, so it doesn't take a person too long to really just jump in and listen to perspective on something, on how to communicate, how to be a better storyteller, or whatever the case may be. What is sound objectivity? So, you know, um, and the podcast has grown organically that way, and there's where I see that I am helping folks, because I see I get a little bit more subscribers every day, and I get a couple more listens every day, and that just means that people are listening, and people are subscribing, and if people are listening and subscribing, then I must be doing something that they appreciate, because they're consuming it. And as long as people are consuming it, I'll continue to produce it, because in 30 years, there's a lot of experiences and a lot of things to talk about, and I'm willing to share it. I'm willing to share this, um, you know, with folks that are willing to listen.
Yeah. And hearing the name Sound Objectivity, it's such a really cool name. Like, my next question is, I'm really curious how did you come up with the name for your podcast?
So it's interesting, because as a mentor, you know um, there there are a couple of things that you try not to do. Although we have a personal relationship, you want to give the best objective advice. You want to be very objective on whatever it is you're sharing with a mentee or with a colleague, whatever the case may be. Many of us, many humans are very emotional when it comes to making decisions. So I wanted to make sure that in my podcast, I'm really only talking about being very objective about your decision making and your reasoning. Now, the reason I put sound in front of it is because we all need to have some level of rationality. We need to have sound advice, not illogical advice, not crazy advice, but sound advice. So, you know, basically, what I do is I provide sound, objective advice. At the end of the day, that's what I try to do. I listen to the situation that you describe. Using that information, I try to make a sound and objective and logical, reasoning of it, to say, here are several paths of that you can choose from to move forward, to reconsider, or whatever the case may be. So again, very, very, very logical in nature as to why I was able to narrow down to sound objectivity.
The name matches you perfectly because I remember like being your intern and being in the room with you, and everything that you described was how you were in the room. You were sound, you were objective, you were logical, and you were strategic. And so the name actually, I feel like it also fits you as a person as well. So I think it's super cool that how you combined it all.
Thank you, thank you.
And then Melissa, my next question, how do you choose your episodes and topics or themes?
So it's interesting because I do it. There are different ways I do that. Sometimes I just look at what's happening in the news, and just see where the temperature is at, just with civilization. I mean, obviously we have wars that are going on. We have trade wars going on. We have actual wars going on. We have political unrest in various parts of the world. We have, a potential recession coming. We have people that are losing their jobs and artificial intelligence. So there are many things that are attacking us from an information perspective. And I think, as myself as a professional, how much of these things are affecting me, and how are they affecting me? You know, I also talk to my colleagues. I talk to other mentees. I talk to basically anyone that is willing to answer the question: how does this all affect you? And how does this affect your decision making? How does this affect your career? And how are you thinking about this? And I get so many responses. I get so many, varied perspectives that allows that reality just gives me a wealth of subjects to discuss. So again, some like we were mentioning before, there's been a lot of talk about imposter syndrome. There's been a lot of talk about how AI is going to take over my job and things of that nature. So I talk about ways to reinforce yourself, and how to leverage AI and to be better. I talk about needing, understanding that you need to change to elevate, and not be scared of this technology. So I talk about things to counter what's happening in the world today, so then that way we're armed and not feel threatened by what's going on. We can use it to our advantage. All of this is opportunity. So I try to use this, all of this stuff that's happening as opportunity to say, hey, you see this? This is how we can best leverage it. Or you see that? This is the best way to maximize yourself. So again, trying just to make sure that I try to, stay very current in times, and try to have as many different perspectives as possible, because the way I look at things as a 30-year professional is very different than a 5-year professional, and very different than a college graduate. So I try to get all those different perspectives on how they see, how does corporate America look like nowadays? And that's vastly different than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's vastly different than 5 years ago. So, and if we're looking at corporate America differently, how is education being looked at differently? What, everybody's desires of a dream job has definitely changed. Again, so there's a wealth of topics out there, just by, watching the news and speaking to, various generations on how they are really matriculating through this thing called life.
And talking about AI, like that's something I've been also being really more strategic about as well. And that's kind of like also what inspired me to also create my content, create my books. I was like, I want to own all my IP, copyright everything. I want to create my own characters. I want to own everything, so that way, when I start to utilize AI, I'm not worried about copyright infringement. I'm not impinging on anybody else's ideas. That's just from like a creative perspective, but even into my workflow. How do I utilize it to make me more efficient? How do I utilize it to make me a better strategic thinker? How do I use it to become a better educator? So it's kind of like, how do you use it as a tool and not be afraid of it? So like I've also been using my own personal projects, like you talk about, always be strategic, always experimenting, always continuing to learn. So I've been using that same philosophy that you've been given us, like, don't be afraid of what's happening. Figure out how can you embrace it, how can you strategize it and move around it to make yourself better and succeed through the challenges.
Absolutely.
So leads me to the next one. What have you learned about yourself through your podcast?
It's interesting. How would I've learned that I've done quite a bit. Actually, it's funny. I as I go and build my episodes out, and even if when I look back, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of experience that I've done. It, sometimes looking back, it doesn't seem like that I've done a lot until I start actually really thinking about it, or I start writing it down, and even just looking back at the episodes, like I just released episode 49, and I just thought I started that the other day, and I'm already up to 49 episodes. So, I learned that I actually have accomplished quite a bit. But I also learned that learning really never does end. I got my MBA many years ago, but I'm still going to school. I've gone to Cornell for the last few years to take classes, and those two things really I have learned through building this podcast. I've done a lot, but there's still so much more to learn. That having a life that's full of learning is something that I've learned to appreciate and appreciate and I enjoy. Like, I enjoy learning, and this podcast has definitely ensured that I stayed learning about my craft and the craft of others.
Yeah. And my next question would be, what is some advice or wisdom you wish someone would have shared with you about hosting and producing a podcast?
You know, I think podcasting and all the technologies around that allow us to podcast is an invaluable tool. I mean, it's uh, the super acknowledgement of our First Amendment rights, where we can say what we want to say. So I mean, we live in a country that allows us to do that. There aren't a lot of places that allow you to do this. So this is a very powerful tool. So I mean, that's the one thing is, understand that podcasting is a very powerful tool, but a powerful tool is only as good as its operator, and the operator in this case is you, the person that is in front of the camera, behind the microphone. Um, and three, all of us have something to say. And, there's a small subset of people that want to say the bad things, they want to spew hate. But for the majority, most of us want to share some really good, inspiring information or experiences or thoughts or opinions. And what I say to anyone that wants to start a podcast, just do it. The hardest thing, the hardest thing for us to do, which is also sometimes the easiest thing to do, is make a decision. Our lives are made up of all of the decisions we made. So we are the totality of the decisions that we make. If you want to podcast, just podcast. Perfectionism is the enemy of good. There is no such thing as a perfect podcast. There's no such thing as a perfect episode. When I record my episodes, I stutter sometimes, and it is what it is, because at the end of the day, if you have a message that you want to share, or you have something that you have to say and you want someone else to hear it because you think it might help them, why not? And that's why podcasting, that's why I started podcasting, and that's why I think anybody should start podcasting. You have something to say, and you think you could help somebody. This is the easiest way and the most efficient way to reach a wide audience, and you can help them just with the sound of your voice and the experiences that you've lived.
Yeah. In regards to like talking about podcasting, those are kind of the same reasons why I created my podcast. It was also because I wanted to connect with more people, but also to connect with the younger self in myself as well. Because when I was younger, I always wanted to create my own universe. I always wanted to create my own characters and connect with them and have them speak with other people. And so I was like, hey, let me honor my childhood dreams and bring it to the world. So the podcast is one of those ways to where I'm also honoring and checking off the box off my childhood dreams and the things I've always wanted to do. So podcasting also gives me the ability to do those things as well. So this leads me to my next part. For this last part, I'm going to ask you some random questions. And so the first thing that comes to you, what has been one of your proudest moments for you while hosting and producing your podcast?
I would say my proudest moment was maybe the first compliment that I received from someone. It's one thing to it's one thing to create an episode and host a podcast. It's another thing for a random stranger to say, "Hey, I really appreciated that." So I think that was probably I want to say my proudest moment, but it was definitely a moment that touched me. It was like, wow, okay, so it's one thing to help, mentees that I've grown very close to and know personally. It's different when a complete stranger, you don't know this person from anything, and they somehow came across my podcast, and they were like, "Hey, this is this was great. Like, thank you for sharing." And so I really like that. That was pretty cool.
What is one thing about yourself you wish your listeners knew about you?
Oh, well, it's interesting because I try to be transparent um, on my podcast, but one of the things that I want my listeners to know is that at the end of the day, we all are trying to win. We're all trying to get better, and as long as you're getting better every day, even if it's a little bit, uh, you're on the right path. So I would want people to know that I live by that mantra, and it's definitely a mantra that hasn't failed me. And hopefully, the people that are listening to the podcast, um, they understand that mantra, and that mantra eventually works with them too.
Last question. Is there anything you would like to share before we end the show?
I would just like to say, first, thank you for inviting me, and I found this very insightful, and I hope your listeners do appreciate it, and I would welcome all of your listeners um, to come and listen to the Sound Objectivity podcast, hosted by me, David Campaña, and you can find my podcast on all podcasting platforms. New episodes on Wednesday, and you can visit www.soundobjectivity.com, where I also have a blog. And if you need any one-on-one coaching or mentorship, you can reach out to me there at david@soundobjectivity.com.
Well, that's a wrap for today's show. Huge thank you to David Campana for taking the time to come on my show. If you like the conversation, feel free to share with a friend or a loved one. Until next time on Aliens with JW, the podcast where aliens have conversation with humans.